Before we talk about Anna Karenina, we need to question something far more uncomfortable. What if the most powerful prison in human history has no walls, no guards, and no locks, and yet millions of people willingly live inside it every day? Most readers approach Anna Karenina believing they already know what destroyed her. They point to love. They point to personal choices. They point to individual flaws. But that assumption may be hiding something much larger. Because when you look beneath the surface, a disturbing possibility begins to emerge. What if the true force shaping Anna's fate was not a person at all? What if it was an invisible system that had been deciding acceptable choices long before she ever made one? That question matters because Anna is not merely a character. She functions as a pressure test. A living experiment. A person placed at the collision point between private desire and public judgment. And once you begin looking at her that way, the entire story starts to change shape. Think about social status for a moment. Most people imagine status as privilege, access, influence, opportunity. The higher you stand, the more freedom you possess. That's the promise. But what if the opposite is sometimes true? What if status doesn't expand freedom? What if it narrows it? This is the paradox at the center of Anna Karenina. The world surrounding Anna is built on an unwritten contract. Reputation is not simply something people have. Reputation is something people serve. It becomes a form of social currency, a silent law operating beneath every conversation, every relationship, every expectation. Nobody needs to announce its rules because everyone already understands them. And that's where the first mystery appears. If a society never physically forces you to obey, but teaches you to fear judgment, are you actually making your own choices? Notice how different that question is from asking whether someone is right or wrong. The deeper issue is power. Not power enforced through violence. Power enforced through perception. Power that exists inside thousands of watching eyes. Power that turns a ballroom full of people into something resembling a courtroom. Power that transforms social approval into survival. One of the most important images to remember throughout this journey is a simple one, a grand room filled with light. Elegant faces. Perfect appearances. Endless conversation. At first glance, it looks like freedom. But look closer and another possibility emerges. Everyone can see everyone else. Yet nobody is entirely free to be seen as they truly are. That image, the brightly lit room, may be one of the most revealing symbols in all of literature. Because the real danger is not punishment. The real danger is anticipation. People begin adjusting themselves before society ever demands it. They become both the prisoner and the guard. And this leads us to a troubling contradiction. The individuals who appear most powerful inside a status-driven system may also become the individuals with the least room to move. The higher the social position, the more carefully every step must be measured. So before we ask whether Anna Karenina could have escaped her fate, we need to ask a much bigger question. What if the tragedy was already present long before any visible conflict began? What if the invisible prison wasn't built around Anna at all? What if it had already been built inside the minds of everyone living around her, and perhaps inside our own as well? If social status acts like an invisible prison, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How does a prison without walls actually control people? The answer is more unsettling than most people expect. It doesn't begin with rules. It begins with identity. Most people assume that social systems operate from the outside in. A society creates expectations, individuals either obey or rebel, and consequences follow. But Anna Karenina points toward a far more sophisticated mechanism. The strongest systems eventually stop policing behavior and start shaping self-perception. In other words, the system wins when people begin carrying it inside themselves. This is where Anna becomes more than a literary character. She becomes a lens through which we can observe a universal human conflict. Not the conflict between one person and society, but the conflict between who we are and who we believe we are allowed to be. And that distinction changes everything. Because notice what happens whenever a person's public identity becomes valuable. The more status they possess, the more fragile that status becomes. What appears to be power slowly transforms into maintenance. What appears to be freedom slowly transforms into performance. The contradiction is remarkable. Society rewards people for becoming visible, then punishes them for stepping outside the image that visibility creates. The result is a strange form of captivity. Imagine standing before a mirror every day. At first, the mirror simply reflects your appearance. But over time, it begins reflecting expectations. Then judgments. Then fears. Eventually, you stop asking, "Who am I?" and start asking, "How will I be seen?" That mirror is one of the most important memory fragments in this entire discussion. Because once identity becomes dependent on perception, reputation stops being an external asset. It becomes part of the self. And now the stakes become much higher. Losing approval no longer feels like losing status. It feels like losing a piece of your existence. This is where many readers focus on individual personalities and miss the larger revelation. The people surrounding Anna are not simply individuals making personal choices. They function as nodes inside a system of mutual observation. Each person watches and is watched. Each judgment reinforces another judgment. Each expectation strengthens another expectation. No single person controls the system. Yet the system controls everyone. And that introduces a mystery that grows more disturbing the longer you examine it. Who is responsible for a prison that nobody consciously built? Think about that for a moment. If one person imposes restrictions, resistance is possible. If a law is unjust, it can be challenged. But what happens when control emerges from thousands of invisible interactions? What happens when social pressure becomes so deeply embedded that nobody even notices it operating? The consequence extends far beyond Anna's world. Scale the pattern outward. From aristocratic circles to modern workplaces. From family expectations to online reputations. From 19th century drawing rooms to social media feeds viewed by millions. The technology changes. The mechanism remains astonishingly familiar. People continue managing impressions. People continue monitoring themselves. People continue negotiating the gap between authenticity and acceptance. And perhaps the most troubling revelation is that the system often requires no direct force at all. Fear of exclusion can become more effective than any formal punishment. The possibility of judgment can become more powerful than judgment itself. Which brings us closer to the heart of the mystery. Maybe the central question is not whether Anna challenged society. Maybe the deeper question is whether anyone inside that world, including the people enforcing its values, was truly free from it. Because if the prison exists inside the mind, if identity itself becomes intertwined with social approval, then the line between victim and participant begins to blur. And once that line disappears, a far larger question emerges. What if the people who appear to defend the system are actually trapped by it just as deeply as the people who seem to suffer from it? But what if the system does not merely trap its victims? What if it also traps its guardians? This is where the conflict becomes far more complicated than a simple struggle between an individual and society. Because once we look closely, the categories of hero, villain, oppressor, and victim begin to collapse. Consider the people who appear to represent order. The individuals who preserve social norms, defend expectations, and protect the boundaries of acceptable behavior. At first glance, they seem powerful. They seem secure. They seem to possess exactly what others fear losing. But there is a hidden contradiction buried inside that appearance. The same system that rewards conformity also demands constant sacrifice. To remain respected, one must remain predictable. To remain accepted, one must remain recognizable. To remain influential, one must remain loyal to the image that society has already approved. The reward and the punishment are connected. The crown and the cage are made from the same material. That is why one of the most powerful memory fragments in this story is the mask of nobility. A mask appears to give someone status. It signals prestige, authority, importance. Yet a mask has another function. It hides. The longer a person wears it, the harder it becomes to remember what exists underneath. And suddenly the conflict expands beyond Anna herself. The question is no longer why one person suffers. The question becomes why entire social systems depend upon performance. Why does society demand masks in the first place? The obvious answer is stability. Every civilization needs expectations. Every community requires rules. Every institution depends upon predictable behavior. Without shared standards, social trust begins to erode. But here comes the contradiction. The very structures designed to create order can eventually become hostile to authenticity. A system built to protect society can slowly lose the ability to understand the individuals living inside it. This is the crisis hidden beneath the surface. Not chaos versus order, but order versus humanity. And once that contradiction emerges, another revelation begins to take shape. The deeper problem is not that people are judged. Human beings have always judged one another. The deeper problem is that judgment gradually becomes disconnected from reality. Over time, appearances start mattering more than truth. Symbols start mattering more than substance. Reputation starts mattering more than character. And when that happens, society begins protecting images instead of people. Notice how this transforms the meaning of social status. Status is no longer merely a ranking system. It becomes a symbolic language. A grand collective story about who deserves respect, who belongs, who is trustworthy, and who must remain outside the circle. But every symbolic system carries a hidden danger. Symbols simplify reality. Human beings do not. The consequence is enormous. When a person's identity becomes reduced to a social symbol, complexity disappears. Contradictions disappear. Humanity itself becomes harder to recognize. The individual becomes an object of interpretation rather than understanding. And this pattern extends far beyond 19th century Russia. Scale outward once again. Every era creates its own symbols. Every era creates approved identities. Every era creates unofficial rules about belonging. The faces change. The mechanism survives. This is why Anna's world continues to feel disturbingly modern. Not because the details are familiar. Because the structure is familiar. The fear of exclusion. The pressure of perception. The exhausting effort required to maintain a socially acceptable self. Yet an even deeper mystery now emerges. If social status operates through symbols, and symbols only possess power when people collectively believe in them, then where does that power actually come from? Does society create the illusion? Or do individuals create it together and then become trapped inside their own creation? Because if the prison is built from shared belief, then the next revelation may be the most unsettling of all. The walls were never made of rules alone. They were made of meaning. And once meaning itself becomes the battlefield, the conflict is no longer social. It becomes psychological. It becomes existential. It becomes a struggle over reality itself. Which raises a question that neither Anna nor the people around her can easily escape. If the system controls people through the meanings they attach to status, what happens when someone begins to question those meanings altogether? What happens when someone begins to question the meaning of status itself? At first, that sounds like a personal act of rebellion. A private shift in perspective. A single individual refusing to accept the values of the surrounding world. But the revelation hidden inside Anna Karenina is far more profound. The moment a person questions the meaning of status, they are not simply challenging a social rule. They are challenging an entire system for producing reality. That is the deeper role Anna occupies within the novel's intellectual architecture. She is not merely a participant inside a social order. She becomes a test of its underlying assumptions. The crucial insight is that status only functions because people believe it reflects something real. Honor. Respectability. Worth. Virtue. But what if those connections begin to break apart? What if social prestige and genuine human value are not the same thing? Suddenly, a dangerous gap appears. A gap between appearance and truth. A gap between public identity and private reality. And that gap is where the deepest tension of the story lives. One of the most revealing memory fragments is not a person but a mirror. Earlier, the mirror reflected judgment. Now it reveals something else. It reveals separation. A person looks into it and discovers two selves staring back. The socially recognized self. And the authentic self. As long as those two remain aligned, life feels stable. But once they begin moving in different directions, every choice becomes heavier. Every decision carries existential weight. This is the revelation that gradually transforms the conflict from social to philosophical. The question is no longer, what will society think? The question becomes, what happens when the person society rewards is no longer the person I believe myself to be? That is a far more dangerous question because there is no external solution. No law can resolve it. No institution can answer it. No amount of status can eliminate it. In fact, the contradiction becomes even sharper. The more successful a person becomes within a symbolic system, the more difficult it may become to escape it. This leads to another revelation. The opposite of freedom is not necessarily oppression. Sometimes the opposite of freedom is dependency on recognition. A person may possess wealth, influence, admiration, and social standing while remaining psychologically dependent on forces they do not control. That dependence creates a fragile existence. Because anything given by collective approval can also be taken away by collective disapproval. Scale outward again and the implications become enormous. Entire civilizations construct symbolic hierarchies. Titles. Ranks. Positions. Categories of prestige. These structures help organize society, but they also shape consciousness. They teach people what to desire. They teach people what success looks like. They even teach people what kind of life is worth living. And that introduces a disturbing possibility. What if many of humanity's greatest struggles are not conflicts over reality itself, but conflicts over socially constructed meanings? What if people spend years pursuing symbols that promise fulfillment while moving further away from their own nature? This is why Anna's significance extends far beyond literature. She becomes a symbol of a universal human dilemma. The tension between belonging and authenticity. Between recognition and selfhood. Between the life that receives approval and the life that feels true. Yet the largest revelation is still incomplete. Because even if status is built on collective belief, and even if those beliefs shape identity, there remains one unanswered question at the center of everything. Why are human beings so willing to trade authenticity for belonging in the first place? And what if the answer has less to do with society than with something far older, deeper, and more fundamental inside human nature itself? If human beings repeatedly choose belonging over authenticity, even when that choice creates suffering, then we arrive at the deepest question in this entire exploration: what was the real trap? The answer is not social status itself. It is not public judgment. It is not even the expectations of society. The core revelation is far more unsettling. The true trap is the belief that personal worth can be secured through external validation. This is the hidden architecture beneath everything we have examined. Status becomes powerful because people mistake recognition for meaning. They begin to believe that being valued by the collective is the same thing as valuing themselves. Once that substitution occurs, an invisible exchange takes place. Freedom is traded for certainty. Authenticity is traded for acceptance. Inner authority is traded for social approval. This is where Anna's role becomes extraordinarily important. She is not simply confronting a social order. She exposes a universal psychological mechanism. A mechanism that exists whenever human beings allow their identity to become dependent on forces outside their control. The crucial insight that many readers miss is that the conflict was never fundamentally about choosing between different lifestyles, relationships, or social expectations. The deeper conflict concerns the source of identity itself. Who has the authority to define a human life? The individual? The community? Tradition? Reputation? Public perception? Once that question emerges, every symbol in the story begins to reorganize itself around a single philosophical center. Consider another memory fragment, a door that is not locked. Most prisons prevent escape through force. But this door remains open. The individual can leave. The individual can reject the rules. The individual can walk away. Yet something still prevents freedom. Why? Because the deepest barriers are no longer external. They have become internal. The person carries the system within. The judgments have become self-judgments. The expectations have become self-expectations. The surveillance has become self-surveillance. This is the revelation hidden beneath the social drama. The most effective systems do not need to control behavior directly. They shape the psychological framework through which people interpret themselves. Once that happens, obedience becomes voluntary. And now the significance of the mirror, the mask, the ballroom, and the watching eyes becomes clear. They are not merely literary symbols. Together they form a map of how identity becomes separated from authenticity. The mask represents the socially approved self. The mirror represents the divided self. The ballroom represents the stage of collective perception. The watching eyes represent the constant pressure of external validation. Combined, they reveal a profound truth about human nature. People often fear exclusion more than they desire freedom. Scale outward and the implications become enormous. Entire cultures can become organized around symbolic approval. Entire economies can reward visibility over substance. Entire generations can begin measuring self-worth through public recognition. The specific symbols change across history, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably stable. Human beings repeatedly seek security in the opinions of others, only to discover that dependence creates new forms of vulnerability. This is why the story continues to resonate long after its original setting disappeared. Its deepest subject is not aristocracy. It is not reputation. It is not even social judgment. Its deepest subject is the human search for identity in a world where meaning is constantly negotiated through other people. And that leads to the consequence that changes everything. If a person's sense of worth is built upon external recognition, then no amount of recognition can ever provide lasting security. The foundation itself remains unstable. Which raises the question that must guide us into the next stage of this journey: if external validation cannot provide a stable identity, what happens to individuals, societies, and civilizations that continue building their lives upon it anyway? If external validation cannot provide lasting stability, then the consequence reaches far beyond a single individual. It spreads outward through relationships, institutions, cultures, and eventually entire civilizations. This is where the legacy of Anna Karenina becomes larger than literature itself. The story does not endure because it describes a particular social class or a particular historical moment. It endures because it reveals a recurring human pattern. People build systems to create belonging. Those systems create standards. Those standards create identities. And eventually those identities become so powerful that they begin shaping reality itself. The consequence is subtle at first. A person stops asking what is true and begins asking what is acceptable. Not because they are dishonest. Not because they are weak. But because acceptance offers security, while authenticity offers uncertainty. Over time, this small adjustment accumulates. A life becomes organized around maintenance rather than discovery. Growth slows. Curiosity narrows. Possibilities disappear before they are ever explored. This is why one of the most haunting memory fragments is the open door. The door remains there. Opportunity remains there. Alternative paths remain there. Yet the individual often remains standing in the same room. Not because escape is impossible, but because the cost of leaving has become psychologically unimaginable. That cost is one of the deepest consequences explored by the novel. The loss is not merely personal freedom. The loss is the ability to imagine freedom. And once imagination becomes constrained, entire societies begin reproducing the same patterns generation after generation. Scale outward and the implications become enormous. Every civilization creates stories about success. Stories about status. Stories about what makes a life meaningful. These narratives provide order, but they also create invisible boundaries around human possibility. Some boundaries are useful. Others become prisons disguised as traditions. The challenge is that people living inside a system rarely recognize its assumptions. To them, those assumptions simply feel like reality. This is part of the legacy that Anna leaves behind. Not a lesson about rebellion. Not a lesson about conformity. But a warning about unconscious participation. A warning that people can inherit values without ever questioning where those values came from. And that warning feels remarkably modern. Today, the symbols have changed. The ballroom has become a digital feed. The mask has become a carefully managed public image. The watching eyes have multiplied beyond anything previous generations could imagine. Yet the underlying mechanism remains familiar. Recognition still creates incentives. Visibility still shapes behavior. Social approval still influences identity. The technology evolved. The psychological architecture survived. This is why the story continues to echo across centuries. It exposes a tension that remains unresolved. Human beings need belonging. Communities matter. Shared values matter. Social trust matters. Yet authenticity matters too. Individual conscience matters. The search for meaning matters. The paradox is that both needs are real. Complete isolation can damage a person. Complete dependence on collective approval can damage a person as well. The challenge is finding a balance that neither society nor the individual fully knows how to achieve. That is the deeper legacy. Not an answer, but an enduring tension. Not a solution, but a permanent question. The mirror remains. The mask remains. The open door remains. And perhaps the most important consequence is that every generation must decide for itself which of those symbols will define its future. But here the mystery becomes even larger. If the need for belonging is woven into human nature itself, then perhaps the problem is not that people seek acceptance. Perhaps the problem begins when acceptance becomes the highest value. And if that is true, what principle could possibly be strong enough to stand above it? Perhaps that is why this story refuses to disappear. Not because it offers a perfect answer, but because it exposes a tension that remains unresolved in every generation. Long after the social customs have changed, long after the institutions have evolved, and long after the world that produced these characters has vanished, the underlying question remains waiting for us. How should a human being live when the need to belong collides with the need to become oneself? The lasting insight is not that society is evil, nor that individuality should always triumph. The deeper insight is that human life unfolds in the space between those two forces. We are shaped by communities, yet we are also called toward something uniquely our own. We inherit meanings, traditions, expectations, and identities, but we also possess the ability to examine them. To question them. To decide whether they still deserve our loyalty. That is what makes the symbols we have carried through this journey so powerful. The mask is not simply a disguise. It is every role we perform to remain accepted. The mirror is not simply a reflection. It is the moment we discover the distance between who we appear to be and who we believe ourselves to be. The open door is not simply an opportunity. It is the realization that freedom often arrives long before we are prepared to embrace it. And the watching eyes are not simply the judgment of others. They are a reminder that some of the strongest forces in human life exist only because we collectively agree that they matter. Yet there is one final layer beneath all of this. The story ultimately asks us to reconsider what it means to be seen. Most people spend their lives seeking recognition. They want respect, validation, approval. They want reassurance that their existence has value. But there is a profound difference between being noticed and being understood. A person can receive endless recognition and still feel invisible. A person can achieve social success and still remain unknown, even to themselves. Perhaps that is why the conflict explored here feels so timeless. It is not fundamentally about reputation. It is about identity. It is not fundamentally about status. It is about meaning. It is not fundamentally about society. It is about the human desire to discover a source of worth that cannot be granted or withdrawn by the crowd. That desire continues to shape modern life just as powerfully as it shaped the world of the novel. We still stand before mirrors. We still wear masks. We still walk through brightly lit rooms filled with watching eyes. We still face open doors that ask difficult questions about who we are willing to become. And maybe the reason this story continues to matter is because it quietly reminds us of something we often forget. The most important decisions in life are rarely about what other people allow us to do. They are about which meanings we choose to accept, which identities we choose to inhabit, and which voices we choose to trust when the expectations of the world and the convictions of the self begin to move in different directions. In the end, the most enduring mystery may not be whether a person can escape the judgments of society. The deeper mystery may be whether any of us can fully distinguish the voice of society from our own. And if we cannot, then how do we ever know whether the life we are living is truly ours?